She said it on a Thursday evening in my kitchen, with her coat still on and a paper bag of groceries on my counter that she had bought without asking what I needed, the way she had always known what I needed before I finished figuring it out myself. She said, "I moved back for one reason." And then she looked at me in a way I had been pretending not to recognize for the better part of 11 years. And everything I had been telling myself about Laura Callum and what she was and wasn't to me rearranged itself very quietly into something I could no longer explain away. I had known her since we were 8 years old. We had grown up 3 streets apart in a town small enough that everyone's business was technically available to everyone else, which meant that Laura and I had been each other's primary witnesses for the parts of childhood that matter and the parts that don't. She knew about the time I cried at a science fair because my volcano didn't erupt. I knew about the summer she decided to be vegetarian for exactly 9 days. We had been at every birthday, every school play, every low-stakes crisis that feels enormous when you are 12 and still feels enormous when you are 32 and you have the context to know better. She had left at 23. Opportunity, she said. A design firm in Edinburgh. Then Copenhagen, then a consultancy in London that had turned into 4 years she described over the phone in the careful language of someone choosing which parts to share. We had stayed in touch the way childhood friends stay in touch when life has pulled them in different directions. Messages at the right moments. Phone calls that ran longer than either of us planned. A standing joke about a bet we had made at 17 that had never officially been settled. I had visited her once, in Edinburgh, 3 years after she left. We had walked for most of a Saturday and talked about everything except the thing that sat underneath all the other things. And then she came back. My name is James Calloway. I am 34 years old. I teach secondary school history in the same town I grew up in, which is not what I planned and is exactly what I would choose now. I live in a house with too many books and a garden I maintain with functional rather than aesthetic ambition. I am good at listening and poor at being listened to. I have a shelf of novels I intend to reread and have not yet gotten around to. I have been, by most accounts, building a life that is full in all the right ways and privately missing one specific thing for longer than I have been willing to name it. Laura Callum was 33. She had grown up 3 streets away, and she had come back 4 weeks ago, staying at her mother's while she sorted out a flat. She had texted me the day she arrived. "I'm back." I said, "I know." Her mother had told my mother, because that is how this town works. She had sent a laughing emoji and said, "I should have known." We had had coffee the next morning, and then lunch 3 days after that, and then she had started appearing at my door in the evenings with no particular announcement, and I had started leaving the door unlocked because it was easier than pretending I wasn't expecting her. She had a specific habit of setting things on my counters when she arrived. Keys, a scarf, the paper bags she brought without asking. She had done it at 8 years old too, setting her school bag on whatever surface was nearest when she came through a door, like she was marking territory without meaning to. I had found it annoying at 8. I had no word for what I found it now. She had been back 4 weeks, and I had spent 4 weeks being very focused on the surface level of things. The coffee, the lunches, the evenings, the way she laughed at things she found funny and went quiet at things she was still deciding whether to say. I had been conducting myself with the careful discipline of a man who knows something and has decided not to know it yet. The paper bag arrived on a Thursday. I had been home for an hour, still in my work clothes, marking papers at the kitchen table when she knocked twice and let herself in. She set the bag on the counter. She did not take her coat off, which was unusual. She had always been comfortable in my spaces in a way she had never had to earn. I said, "You're keeping your coat on." She said, "I might need to leave quickly." I said. Why would you need to leave quickly? She said. Depending on how this goes. I set my pen down. She opened the paper bag. She took out vegetables in the specific sequence of someone doing something with their hands because their hands need something to do. She said, I'm going to make dinner. And while I make dinner, I'm going to tell you something, and you don't have to say anything until the dinner is done. I said, that is a very structured approach. She said, I have been planning it. I said, for how long? She said, about 11 years. The kitchen went quiet in the way it goes quiet when a room catches up with what has just been said. Outside, someone's car went past. The radiator did its small percussive thing. I looked at her from across the counter, and she looked at the vegetables. And neither of us said anything for long enough that saying nothing became its own kind of statement. She said, I'm going to start with the courgettes, if that's all right. I said, absolutely. She cooked. I sat at the table and watched in the way I had been watching her for 4 weeks, without calling it watching. She had a method for everything, the knife, the pan, the heat, that was practiced without being showy. She had always been like that, competent in ways she didn't announce. She said, without turning around, I took the job in Edinburgh because I needed to leave. I said, I know. She said, do you know why? I said no. She turned just enough to look at me over her shoulder. She said, because staying was getting very difficult. Being here and not saying things I wasn't sure I was allowed to say. I thought if I left, I would either get over it or understand it better. I thought distance would make it smaller. I said, did it? She turned back to the pan. She said, it made it extremely clear, which is a different outcome. I said, clear in what way? She said, James. She said it in the tone she used when I was being technically obtuse, which she had deployed on me since we were 11. She said, I'm getting to it. I have an order. I said, right. She said, Edinburgh was fine. Copenhagen was good, actually. London was when I understood that I had been using work to avoid a question I had already answered. She paused. She said, I had a very sensible relationship in London. He was a good person. We wanted compatible things. I ended it after 14 months because when something good happened, he was the third person I wanted to tell. I said, who were the first two? She said, my mum. And you. In that order, but the gap between first and second was much smaller than the gap between second and third. Something in my chest shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough. I said, Laura. She said, I'm still getting to it. I said, okay. She said, I moved back because I have been doing an extended audit of my life and what I want from it, and the answer kept coming back to a specific list of things, and at the top of that list was this town and my mum and the specific person who leaves his door unlocked because he knows I'm coming over. I said nothing. She turned the heat down. She said, to the pan, I moved back for one reason, and that reason knows where I am every evening this week, and he has not asked me why I'm here this much, which I think means he already knows. She paused. She said, but I would like to say it, because I have been not saying it for 11 years, and I think it has earned being said. She turned around then. She was still holding the wooden spoon, which was the most Laura thing about this entire moment. She said, I came back because of you. Not a version of you I made up to feel better about being far away. You, specifically, the one who cried at the science fair and still pretends he didn't. I said, I did not cry at the science fair. She said, James. I said there were allergies. She said, "It's okay that you cried at the science fair. It is one of my favorite things about you." She looked at me steadily. She said, "I have approximately 40 more favorite things, if you want the list." I should tell you that I had an elegant response somewhere in the back of my mind. Something measured and well-constructed, the kind of thing you say when you are a person who teaches young people how to think carefully about the past. What actually happened is that I stood up from the table, and I walked around the counter and I said, "I left the door unlocked because I was hoping you would come back to this town, and you did, and I still could not figure out how to say it." She said, "You're saying it now." I said, "You said it first." She said, "I said it first." "Yes," I said, "you always do." She looked at me in the way she had been looking at me for 4 weeks and probably longer. She said, "There's something I need to know." I said, "Ask it." She said, "Was it always this, for you?" I said, "Since we were 18, probably, maybe before that." I was slow to understand it. She said, "You are slow to understand a lot of things." I said, "I teach history. I am good with hindsight." She laughed. It started small, and then it committed, and she was still holding the wooden spoon, and I put my hand over hers on the handle of it, and she went still in the way she went still when something had landed. Then she said, "Something is going to burn." I said, "Nothing is going to burn." She said, "I have it on low, but..." I said, "Let it be on low." She looked at me. She said, "Okay." I turned the hob off. She did not object. We stood in the kitchen for a long moment, close in the way that is no longer deniable, and she put her free hand against my arm, the way you touch something you are making sure is real, and I said her name once, quietly, and she said, "I know." And I believed her. The dinner was fine, eventually, slightly overcooked, which she declared was my fault for the interruption, which was not entirely wrong. We ate at the kitchen table with the papers I had been marking pushed to one end, and she stole things from my plate in the specific way she had been stealing from my plate since we were 9. And at some point I looked across the table at her and thought, this is the version. This is what the list was always pointing toward. She found a flat 2 streets over in November, close enough that she still appeared at my door most evenings, except now she knocked less, and the door was not just unlocked but usually open, which is a different thing. I stopped pretending not to expect her. She stopped bringing the paper bags as an excuse and started bringing them because she wanted to, which she said was a meaningful distinction. I told her I thought that was a generous interpretation. She said she had generous interpretations of a lot of things when it came to me. I said I was going to need a minute. She said, "Take your time. I have been waiting 11 years. I can wait a minute." A year later, when people asked us when it started, we gave different answers. I said, "When she came back." She said, "Long before that, and you were just the last one to know." I said, "That was uncharitable." She said, "It was accurate." Both of those things were true. Her mother told my mother everything. Obviously, this town still works the way it works. My mother called me a week after the kitchen conversation and said, "About time." I said I had no idea what she was referring to. She said, "James." And I said, "I know." Nothing about us had changed, really. She still appeared at my door without announcement. I still left it unlocked. She still set things on my counters when she arrived. Keys, a scarf, the paper bags she chose without asking. I still stole moments to watch her when she thought I wasn't. The only difference was that now neither of us had to look away when the other one noticed. It had probably always been her. 3 streets away in a town too small for secrets, and it had still taken us 11 years to say the thing we had both already known. I had needed her to come back and keep her coat on and hold a wooden spoon in my kitchen to finally understand that I had been leaving the door open for her long before I called it that. What would you have done if your childhood best friend came back and told you they'd moved home for one reason, and that reason was you? And have you ever kept something unsaid for so long that saying it felt like both the bravest and most obvious thing in the world? Tell me your story in the comments. If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.